Can a place that seems like an earthly paradise become an arena for the worst human tragedies? October 2018. On the picturesque island of Bora Bora, where turquoise waters lap white beaches and romance seems endless, a private villa hidden among coconut trees witnessed an event that changed the lives of two people forever. Madeleine Lavoie, a 30-year-old talented PR specialist from Montreal, traveled to this tropical paradise island to spend her honeymoon with her husband Marcus Jameson, a successful entrepreneur. Their vacation seemed perfect. At least that's how it looked in the photos that Madeleine actively posted on social media. But the idyll did not last long. One morning, the staff entered their villa to find a horrific scene. Shards of a champagne bottle, signs of a struggle, and bloodstains told a story that the couple could no longer complete. Only one of them survived. What happened on that fateful night, and how did heaven on earth turn into a nightmare? Madeleine Lavoie grew up in Montreal, one of Canada's largest cities, known for its unique cultural heritage and harmonious blend of English and French. Her childhood was spent in an atmosphere of love and support created by her parents, Camille, a teacher of French literature, and Jean-Paul Laveau, an architect. It was from them that Madeleine inherited her love of aesthetics, creativity, and attention to detail. From an early age, the girl stood out among her peers for her natural charisma and ability to find an approach to any person. Her friendliness and ability to listen attentively made her a favorite in any circle. Friends recall that Madeleine always attracted people to her, not because of her desire for attention, but because of her sincerity and the warmth she radiated. After graduating from high school, she decided to enroll in the University of Montreal, where she chose to major in communications and marketing. Already as a student, she demonstrated a talent for organization. Charity events, festivals, and cultural events were her element. These skills later became the basis for her successful career in PR. At the time of her meeting with Marcus Jameson, Madeleine was working for a prestigious PR agency, organizing large-scale international projects and campaigns for major brands. Her clients have repeatedly recognized her creativity and professionalism. Living in her own apartment in the heart of Montreal, Madeleine devoted her free time to art, traveling, and meeting friends in cozy cafes or at exhibitions. Marcus Jameson spent his childhood in Toronto, a city with a multifaceted culture and numerous opportunities for development. However, his early years were far from uneventful. His father, George Jameson, worked in the construction industry and was strict and authoritarian. Constant financial difficulties affected his mood, making him irritable and even aggressive. Marcus's mother, Evelyn, was a housewife who tried to keep the family calm, although she often suffered from psychological pressure from her husband. Marcus grew up in a family atmosphere where emotions were suppressed by silence and conflicts were mostly resolved through anger. At school, he stood out among his peers for his determination and intelligence. Teachers admired his leadership skills, although his straightforwardness sometimes made his peers wary. After graduating from high school, Marcus entered the University of Toronto on a scholarship for high academic achievement. There he chose to major in computer science and entrepreneurship. It was during his student years that he launched his startup, which eventually grew into a thriving technology business. His key product, automated software for optimizing business processes, attracted the interest of leading investors. By the time he met Madeleine Laveau, Marcus was already a recognized entrepreneur with an excellent reputation. He often spoke at international conferences, serving as an example of success and ambition. But behind the outward image of a man who had achieved everything, he hid deep emotional wounds that gave rise to his desire to control everything around him. The story of Madeleine and Marcus began in 2016 when they first met at a conference in Ottawa. Madeleine was attending the event as a representative of her PR agency, while Marcus was presenting his startup. They met by chance during a conversation on the sidelines. Marcus was immediately drawn to her confident posture and charming smile, while Madeleine was impressed by his sharp mind and ambition. Over the next few weeks, they kept in touch through correspondence. A month later, Marcus traveled to Montreal to ask Madeleine out on a date. Their relationship developed rapidly. Joint trips, luxurious dinners, and expensive gifts became part of their daily lives. Marcus often made generous gestures to demonstrate his status and desire to impress Madeleine. In 2018, During a romantic trip to Paris, Marcus proposed marriage at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. Madeline did not hesitate to accept, as she saw him not only as a successful man, but also as a reliable support and stability. Their wedding was a remarkable event, bringing together guests from all over Canada. The lavish celebration left an unforgettable impression on their surroundings. However, after the engagement, the first warning signs began to appear. Marcus became more picky about Madeline's work, often expressing dissatisfaction with her participation in social events, communication with clients, and social media activity. His behavior gradually became controlling, demanding reports on her whereabouts and checking her phone, which made Madeline increasingly anxious. One evening, during a company event, Marcus became jealous when he noticed Madeline chatting with one of his colleagues. After that, he strictly forbade her to attend such events without his accompaniment. Madeline tried to explain that participating in such events was an important part of her professional life, but eventually agreed to avoid arguments. Her friends noticed that she became less social, attended meetings less often, and seemed more withdrawn. However, Madeline herself tried to convince herself that everything would change after the wedding and that Marcus's controlling ways would disappear. Unfortunately, these first signals were only a prelude to much more serious problems in their marriage. The wedding, which was a true show of wealth and style, marked a new stage in their lives. After the celebration, Marcus and Madeline went on their honeymoon. Bora, with its crystal-clear lagoons, white beaches, and secluded villas on the water, seemed like the perfect place to start their married life. Marcus chose this destination, convinced that their marriage deserved only the best. When the couple arrived on the island, they looked happy. Madeline was delighted with the luxurious atmosphere of their villa, a jacuzzi overlooking the ocean, chilled champagne, and a romantic candlelit dinner created a fairy tale feel. She shared the moments on social media, adding captions that conveyed her emotions. Dream honeymoon. We did it. However, behind the outward idyll that their photos showed, there were warning signs that began to appear at the beginning of their honeymoon. At first, Marcus was caring and attentive. He organized everything to the smallest detail. He booked expensive excursions, planned romantic dinners, trying to create the perfect atmosphere for their vacation. But over time, his behavior began to change. The care gradually turned into obsession and a desire to control every moment. Madeline noticed that Marcus became nervous when she talked to the resort staff or picked up her phone to take pictures of the scenery for her social media. Instagram again? Is that more important than us spending time together? He once said with a tinge of reproach. I just want to preserve this moment. It's our memories, Marcus, she replied, trying to speak calmly to avoid an argument. However, Marcus's discontent gradually grew. When Madeline showed courtesy to other guests or employees, he remained silent, but his gaze became increasingly stern and cold. On October 7th, they decided to spend the evening at a bar located on the resort's premises. This place was popular with vacationers who gathered there to share their experiences and enjoy the pleasant atmosphere. Light music and the sound of conversation created a relaxed mood. Madeline, known for her ability to quickly find a common language with people, eagerly struck up a conversation with an elderly man at the next table. He was enthusiastically sharing stories about his travels around the world, and Madeline, always open to new acquaintances, listened with interest. How wonderful it sounds. I've been dreaming of going to Amalfi for a long time, Madeline said, smiling happily. Marcus was sitting next to her, but he was silent. At first he just watched, but his face gradually grew gloomy. His fingers kept twirling the glass with the drink, revealing his inner tension. Isn't that enough? He suddenly interrupted her conversation. What do you mean? She asked, turning to him in surprise. I mean that you're talking too much already, or have you forgotten that I'm here? His voice was calm, but every word was laced with irritation. Marcus, please don't exaggerate. It's just a polite exchange of words, she replied, trying to remain calm, although she noticed his gaze had turned cold and almost threatening. An exchange of words? You seem to have completely forgotten about me. His voice grew louder, and several patrons at neighboring tables began to turn in their direction. Stop, please. You're exaggerating, Madeline whispered, feeling a wave of embarrassment. Exaggerate? He was almost shouting now. You're the one humiliating me in front of all these people. Madeline tried to get up from her chair, but Marcus grabbed her arm tightly. We're leaving, he said abruptly, leaving her no choice. The security cameras captured their walk back to the villa. He held her hand, but it looked more like control than a gentle gesture. Her movements seemed tense, and his grip was too tight. They entered their villa, and the door closed behind them, enveloping the entire resort in nighttime silence. However, the peace was deceptive. The neighbors could hear Marcus's voice growing louder and sharper behind the closed door. His accusations sounded more and more aggressive. Madeline tried to speak quietly, but her voice sometimes broke, and she sounded fearful and anxious. One of the guests later said that he heard Marcus shouting loudly, "I'm tired of you always putting yourself above me. Why do I have to put up with this?" The shouting finally subsided, but the tension remained in the air. Inside the villa, the atmosphere was tense to the point of overwhelm. Madeline made one last attempt to avoid conflict by addressing him in a quiet and almost pleading tone. "Marcus, let's stop. We both need some peace. Let's talk about this tomorrow." His gaze was full of coldness and unbridled anger. "Do you really think you can run away? Just avoid me? After everything you've done?" Marcus wheezed, gritting his teeth and moving toward her. Madeline realized that this evening could end in disaster, so she decided to lock herself in the bathroom to give him time to cool off. She quickly closed the door and pressed her back against it, holding the handle, trying to keep him from entering. But Marcus was not going to stop. His blows on the door became stronger and stronger. At first, he was pounding with his fists, and then he started hitting with his shoulder. His screams could be heard throughout the villa. "Do you think the door will save you? Open it at once, Madeline." After a few minutes of continuous hitting, the door began to crack. Madeline was trembling with fear, her body huddled in the corner of the bathroom. She looked for some kind of shelter, but there was little room and little hope. The door finally gave way. Marcus burst into the bathroom, holding a bottle of champagne in his hand that he had grabbed in the living room. His face was twisted with rage and his hands were shaking with tension. "Are you trying to humiliate me again? Do you think I'm going to let it go?" he shouted, breaking the silence. Madeleine, squeezed in the corner, silently raised her hands, trying to stop him. But this gesture only increased his anger. The first blow with the bottle was inaccurate. The glass flew in all directions, smashing against the wall next to Madeleine. The shards fell to the floor, creating chaos. Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed the remains of the bottle and rushed toward her again. "Marcus, please stop. You don't know what you're doing," cried Madeline, dodging and trying to escape. But he could no longer hear her. His first blow, a piece of glass, hit her in the arm as she tried to protect her face. Blood slowly flowed down her fingers, leaving bright red marks on the marble floor. Madeline tried to resist, but Marcus was much stronger. The second blow hit her in the head, causing severe bleeding. She staggered and fell to the cold tiles. Her defensive movements became slower and less determined. Marcus, seized with uncontrollable anger, struck him again and again with the bottle shards. Blood spread across the floor, creating a horrifying contrast to the white tiles. Shards of glass, a torn towel, and overturned cosmetic bottles completed the picture of chaos. The fatal blows ended this horror. Subsequently, forensic experts concluded that her death was caused by multiple head injuries that caused serious damage to her skull. Madeline's body was left lying on the bathroom floor amidst shards of glass and pools of blood. As the reality of what had happened began to sink in, Marcus slowly knelt down beside his wife's motionless body. His hands were shaking and his eyes were filled with confusion. He stared at the piece of glass still in his hand. "What have I done? Why did this happen?" he whispered, addressing himself and someone who was no longer there. He slowly brought the shard to his wrist. His movements were chaotic, without clear intent or control. The first cuts were shallow, with blood barely showing on the surface of the skin. He tried several times to do more serious damage, but each time he stopped, watching the drops of blood slowly fall to the marble floor. After a while, Marcus came out of the bathroom, glass in hand, and collapsed on the living room couch. His clothes were stained with blood, and his eyes remained blank. This is how the resort staff found him when they entered the villa. When the maid entered the villa to perform her duties, she screamed when she saw pools of blood on the floor and Madeline's motionless body in the bathroom. Her scream attracted the attention of other resort employees, who immediately ran to the scene. One of them quickly dialed the emergency number, calling the police. When the police arrived, they found Marcus in a state of shock. He sat motionless, barely responding to their questions. He only repeated quietly, "I don't remember. I didn't mean to do it." The doctors examined Marcus and treated his cuts, which turned out to be superficial. He was then taken to a local hospital under police supervision. A blood test showed the presence of alcohol, but the content was insufficient to explain his behavior. The scene the police found was a nightmare. The entire bathroom resembled a picture of violence. The marble floor was covered with blood. There were shards of glass, broken furniture, and wood from the destroyed door. An overturned lamp at the entrance testified to the fierce struggle. That night forever changed the atmosphere of Villa 7. A perfect honeymoon that promised to be fabulous turned into a tragedy that left a deep mark on the walls of this place. The investigation began immediately after the resort staff called the police. The police officers who arrived at the scene were faced with a horrifying sight. The marble in the bathroom was stained with blood. Glass shards and broken furniture created an atmosphere of complete chaos. The remains of the bathroom door were hanging on its hinges, and the whole scene told the story of a violent and uncontrollable quarrel that ended in tragedy. In the center of the gruesome scene was Madeline's body, soaked in blood, with numerous wounds on her body, testifying to the brutality of the attack. Investigators concluded that a broken bottle of champagne used during the conflict was the murder weapon. Marcus's fingerprints were clearly visible on the bottle shards. Their location indicated that it was he who was holding the bottle at the time of the attack. Experts also found small pieces of glass in the wounds on Madeline's arms and face, indicating that she had tried to defend herself to the last. The key to the case was the footage from the resort's surveillance cameras. One of them shows Marcus dragging Madeline to the villa by force after a quarrel in the bar. Her gait was unsteady. She was visibly trying to slow down, but Marcus's firm grip did not allow her to stop. Another camera, located near the corridor of their villa, recorded the muffled sounds of an argument, shouting and hitting. Testimony from resort staff only confirmed this picture. The waiters recalled how the tension between the couple had been building since dinner. Marcus raised his voice several times, accusing Madeline of unacceptable behavior, and she tried to calm him down and prevent a public scene. One of the bartenders said that he noticed Marcus clutching his glass as if he was ready to explode in rage. The preliminary conclusions of the investigators were unequivocal. The tragic events of that night were the result of a gradual escalation of a long-running conflict that had reached a critical point. After his arrest, Marcus appeared confused and emotionally distant. His speech was confused and his behavior apathetic. When he was provided with a lawyer, he began to partially answer questions, although he insisted that he did not remember the details of that night. The psychologists who began to analyze Marcus's condition drew up a multifaceted psychological portrait. He grew up in an unfavorable environment in Toronto. His father was cruel and harsh, often showing aggression towards both his son and his mother. This atmosphere left deep scars on his mind. Since childhood, Marcus felt under constant pressure to live up to expectations and prove his worth for fear of disappointing his father. His mother, Evelyn Jameson, although she tried to support her son, was herself in the shadow of her fears and helplessness. She rarely took his side, fearing that it would only make her husband even angrier. In such circumstances, Marcus developed an inferiority complex and a need to keep everything under his control. As he grew up and achieved success in the tech industry, Marcus learned to hide his insecurities behind a mask of charisma and strength. But in moments of intense stress or tension, his restraint would break down, giving way to uncontrollable anger and jealousy. Psychologists noted that he had considerable difficulty in dealing with stressful situations and containing negative emotions. His jealousy, which became evident in his relationship with Madeline, stemmed from a fear of being abandoned or rejected. The loss of control during a bar fight could have been the trigger that set off the horrific chain of events that night. Additionally, investigators found several messages on Marcus's phone that he had sent to Madeline shortly before their conflict. In these texts, he accused her of not appreciating his efforts and not showing him respect. This was further evidence of the growing tension in the couple's relationship and Marcus's emotional instability. Police also interviewed Madeline's friends and colleagues to gather more information about her relationship with Marcus. A close friend of hers said that Madeline had repeatedly mentioned his tendency to be overly controlling. However, she always justified his actions, claiming that it was only a manifestation of his care and desire to create the best possible conditions for them. This testimony confirmed that the problem of jealousy and desire for control had existed long before their trip to Bora Bora. Investigators continued to gather evidence that increasingly indicated that the tragedy was no accident. It was the culmination of a long-lasting emotional tension that eventually got out of control. The trial of Marcus Jamieson began in October 2019, exactly 1 year after the events that shook the public. The case caused a wide media response, so the courtroom was crowded with journalists, Madeline's friends, and members of the public. Her parents, Camille and Jean-Paul Laveau, were sitting in the front row. Their faces reflected indescribable pain and fatigue, and they held a photograph of their daughter in their hands. The prosecutors built the case around jealousy and uncontrollable anger as the driving forces behind the crime. In their opening statement, the prosecution emphasized, this was not a spontaneous act or a momentary outburst of emotion. It was the result of a long accumulation of aggression that ultimately led to a horrific and deadly attack. A key piece of evidence in the case was a broken bottle of champagne with Marcus's fingerprints clearly visible on it. Forensic experts confirmed that the murder weapon was used with intentional force. The nature of the wounds indicated that the attack was not only brutal, but also prolonged. A key piece of evidence in the case was surveillance footage showing Marcus forcibly taking Madeline to the villa that night. Prosecutors paid special attention to his violent behavior, emphasizing he held her hand with such force that it was more like coercion than support. Witnesses, including staff and waiters at the resort, testified about the events in the bar that evening. They recalled Marcus yelling at Madeline, publicly humiliating her. One of the bartenders admitted that he felt the tension between them could have escalated into something more serious, but none of the employees intervened. The court was also provided with messages from Madeline's phone, which revealed Marcus's control even before their wedding. In the text, he demanded that she report on her movements and criticize her activity on social media, which confirmed the ongoing tension in their relationship. This tragedy is the result of years of escalation. Marcus's jealousy, constant monitoring, and growing anger finally got out of control that night. The prosecutors concluded their speech. The defense, for its part, tried to change the perception of the events, describing Marcus not as an aggressor, but as a person who was in a state of severe emotional distress. The lawyers emphasized his childhood traumas and years of psychological pressure, which eventually led to his emotional breakdown that night. Marcus Jamieson is not a monster. He is a man who was unable to cope with his emotions. His actions, while tragic, were not premeditated, said the lead counsel in his opening statement. Psychologists testified at the trial and told about Marcus's difficult childhood. They described how his father was cruel to both him and his mother, developing a fear of rejection and uncontrollable outbursts of anger. Psychologists noted that Marcus's old psychological traumas may have been exacerbated that night. His perception of Madeline's behavior as humiliation or rejection could have been a trigger. They emphasized that, although Marcus's jealousy was not justified, it was exacerbated by his emotional instability and alcohol consumption. The defense lawyers also emphasized that the suicide attempt after the crime reflected deep regret and awareness of the crime. They asked the court to take these circumstances into account as mitigating factors. However, the defense strategy had significant gaps. The prosecutors insisted that despite Marcus's difficult past, the cruelty of his actions could not be justified. They reminded the court that Marcus's controlling behavior, as reflected in his messages, had existed long before the tragic night. After 3 weeks of hearings, the jury went to deliberate. The verdict was reached quickly. Marcus Jamieson was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, reading the verdict, emphasized, "This tragedy that occurred that night was completely avoidable. Despite your difficult life circumstances, you made a conscious choice that led to the death of your wife." Marcus was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The court also ruled that he must undergo a mandatory psychological rehabilitation program aimed at working with his emotional trauma and anger control issues. After hearing the verdict, Madeline's family remained silent. Her mother, Camille, spoke to journalists briefly. "This will not bring our daughter back, but maybe her story will help save someone's life." Although the trial ended the public part of this tragedy, it left deep wounds for everyone involved. For Camille and Jean-Paul Laveau, Madeline's parents, her death was a source of unbearable pain that they decided to channel into the fight for justice. Just a few months after the trial ended, they set up the Light of Madeline Charity Foundation to fight domestic violence and psychological pressure. "We can't bring Madeline back, but we can do everything we can to make sure that no other woman has to go through such a horror," Camille said during the foundation's first press conference. The foundation focuses its activities on organizing lectures, seminars, and social campaigns aimed at raising awareness of the warning signs of toxic relationships. Camille and Jean-Paul often participated in public events, sharing Madeline's story to warn others of the dangers. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. The public actively supported the foundation's initiatives. Several legislative reforms were launched in Canada to increase penalties for domestic violence cases. Camille confided in her friends that working for the foundation was a way for her to feel like she was continuing her daughter's work. Marcus's family, who had previously led a quiet middle-class life in Toronto, found themselves at the center of public condemnation. His parents, George and Evelyn Jameson, were shocked by what happened and for a long time refused to believe that their son could commit such a horrible act. "Marcus has always been a good boy," Evelyn said in an interview. "We had no idea that he was carrying so much pain inside of him." However, society was not ready for sympathy. Marcus's family faced constant gossip, insults, and even open threats. To escape the pressure, they sold their house and moved to another city. George, who had always tried to maintain the image of a successful and confident man, became withdrawn and rarely left the house. Evelyn turned to a psychologist to find a way to cope with the shame and guilt that haunted her because of the belief that she failed to raise her son properly. The villa where the tragedy occurred remained closed for several months due to the ongoing investigation. Despite all the efforts of the resort's administration to restore the place to its former reputation, the incident left an indelible mark on people's minds. Once an ideal symbol of romance, Bora has become associated with violence and tragedy. The resort was repeatedly mentioned in the news and in court reports, which only reinforced the negative perception. The owners of the resort attempted to change the purpose of the villa, but staff said that many employees did not even want to enter it. They felt something they called the presence of tragedy. A year after the incident, the number of bookings dropped by 40%. To attract new guests, the resort had to significantly reduce prices. After the sentencing, Marcus was transferred to a correctional facility in British Columbia. Initially, he was kept separate, avoiding contact with other inmates, and spent most of his time alone in his cell. According to the psychologists who worked with him, Marcus was in a state of denial. He kept repeating that it was not his fault. However, over time, through therapy, he began to realize how traumas from his past affected his behavior. In conversations with specialists, Marcus admitted that he often felt cornered when he lost control of the situation. "I loved her, but I ruined everything," he once confessed during a session. He later joined a support group for prisoners who worked on managing their anger. Marcus also started keeping a diary in which he shared his experiences and reflections on how jealousy and a desire for control led to the fatal events. This story is a warning about how unhealed trauma, jealousy, and the desire for control can turn love into tragedy. It emphasizes the importance of paying attention to the first signs of a toxic relationship and seeking help before it's too late. If you or someone close to you is experiencing emotional or physical abuse, don't stay silent. Ask for help because a timely step can save lives.